Welcome to the Africa Early Stage Investor Summit for 2021. It is an honor to be here for me coming from New York because Africa is the future of entrepreneurship. And I say that having had a lot of experience as an entrepreneur and as an early stage investor in companies around the world. But before we discuss the future of Africa, what's happening here in this extraordinary ecosystem, let me take you back about 600 years to another continent to talk about another person. And this guy, Johan Gutenberg, if you ask most people who he is or what he did, they'll tell you, well, he's clearly an inventor, one of the great inventors. What did he invent? He invented the printing press. Well, no, he actually didn't invent the printing press. What Johan Gutenberg invented was this thing. This is a mold for casting lead into pieces of movable type that can be put together to create the words on a page so you can then print a book. So that's what Gutenberg invented. And then he printed a book, and most people think of him as an inventor or as a printer, or maybe because he published a book, he was the first publisher of books out there. But we who are at this summit know differently. He was all those things, but he was something even more important, and that is he was an entrepreneur. Johann Gutenberg, was an exquisite, extraordinary entrepreneur. He had been trained as a goldsmith, but he was entrepreneurial, that 1% of the population who are natural-born entrepreneurs. And he saw a hole in the market. He saw a need for an increasingly literate population that was reading books, but that didn't have books because it took a year or more to write one book out by hand. So he figured out how to create movable type. He figured out then how to put it in a converted laundry press and ended up creating the printing press for books. And he published his book, which was the first thing he did, look for the market. What has the largest total addressable market? And the answer is, it was the Bible. And so Gutenberg, starting in 1450, began to print the Bible. It took him over 4 years with a whole staff of workmen. And at the end of that time, he had produced 180 copies of the Bible, which, considering that until then it would take one person well over a year to write out the Bible by hand, Gutenberg managed to revolutionize the industry. And he didn't just revolutionize printing because there was no industry, he created it. He did something more important than that. He revolutionized the world because as an entrepreneur, he had solved a problem that became apparent that it wasn't just in his town of Mainz in Germany where this was a problem. He had customers all over Europe. And what do you think happened as soon as his Bible was finished? Well, all the people who had worked on that now understood that you could create a press and print books. And so his workmen went off to start their own printing presses. And within 10 years of the time that he had started, there were a dozen presses around Europe, in Italy, across Germany, in France. And then it began to grow from there. If it was a dozen in 1460, it was 3 dozen in 1470, and it grew from there, 1480. 1490, you're now expanding into England with Caxton and Spain and Portugal and the Netherlands and Russia. 1500, you now have every town, every city across Europe now has printing presses that are churning out books. And so here you have this one guy, this entrepreneur, changed the world. It took him 4 years to print 180 copies of the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, of which 42 now exist. So let me ask you this question to help you scale it in your own mind. With all these people who were copying him and following on creating printing presses, how many other books were printed, physical volumes of books were printed between the time Gutenberg started and the end of the 15th century? So from 1450 to 1500, take a guess as to how many books were printed. And you might think hundreds. Well, certainly more than hundreds, right? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Could it be hundreds of thousands? Well, you know how many books were printed? Hold your seats. Over 8 million books were printed from the time Gutenberg started to 1500. And so why? That's because technology doesn't grow linearly the way we're used to thinking of things as people, one step in front of another, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Technology, as Ray Kurzweil pointed out, grows exponentially since the beginning of recorded human history. And that exponentially is like doubling every 18 months. So it starts off very, very small if you look at Gutenberg and his printing press, and the increments seem small, but then they grow more and more and faster and faster and faster. And that's why the iPhone in your pocket today can have a chip that does 20 trillion instructions per second. And so it's not just technology, it's the entrepreneurs and the startup companies around them that grow at least as fast. In startup tech world with the internet and technology began in the US in Northern California, what we call Silicon Valley, for the silicon chips that were involved. And so the first tech company started there, Fairchild Semiconductor and beyond. They expanded to much of the Bay Area and San Francisco, extended across America. I began my first tech company in New York City in 1981, and somebody back then called me a patriarch of Silicon Alley. Well, it's easy to be a patriarch if there are no other family members out there, because back then when I started, there were only 4 other tech companies. You know how many tech companies there are in New York City today? Over 9,000. And if you count the ones that are a single person in a garage setting up a company, starting a company, it's many, many times more than that. But it wasn't just in the US either. Technology companies like these started in the US, but then they began to expand. So 20 years ago, 10 years ago, you had a majority of new companies being started in the world were American. But you know what? A majority are now ROW, the rest of the world. And so you have entrepreneurship growing, you have applied technology to all kinds of challenges growing across the world. And you know where the fastest growing startup world is? It's not America, it's Africa. The compound annual growth rate for startup companies in Africa that are doing the sort of high growth startups that get funding from angel investors and VCs, 46% compound annual growth over the last 5 years. Compare that to the single-digit growth for the rest of the world. So what is it that is driving this ecosystem, this entrepreneurship innovation ecosystem in Africa? Well, it's a whole bunch of different things, starting with population growth. Africa has the fastest growing population in the world, and because people don't start old, they start young, it's a very young population. So you have a young and growing population. Young people are more energetic, they are more attuned to the latest technology, they are starting businesses, and so they are using technology as well. And on top of that, they're all connected. How are they connected? Well, they're connected by mobile communications. While there was not a lot of landline telephony in Africa in the mid-20th century, with the explosion of cellular and mobile digital phones and now satellite phones, you're seeing mobile communications spreading across to virtually everybody on the continent and bringing with it the penetration of the internet. And so you have great internet penetration and access to all that entails around the world. And speaking of around the world, we've now seen in recent years the beginnings of the globalization of investment. So you have investors from around the world who are looking cross-border, from the US, from Asia, from the Middle East, from Europe, are investing in African startups. But most of the investing in African startups comes from African investors, which means that's also growing. And so there is today a large network of angel investors, venture capital funds, and support organizations in Africa investing in African activities, in African startups. And what kind of startups are these? Well, there aren't too many space-related companies and rocket science companies, but what you have is a continent which is ripe for improvement in a lot of basic areas. And so therefore, you're seeing the application of emerging technologies to improve access for people in Africa to healthcare, financial services, education, energy. This is a tabula rasa. This is an open playing field in which every single thing on the continent can be disrupted by technology, and that's what's happening. And this is not a phenomenon that is unique to Nigeria or South Africa. No, this is actually happening across the entire continent. If you take a look at the geographical distribution of $1 million plus startup rounds in Africa just in the last 2 years, you will see that it goes from top to bottom, east to west of the continent. And why? Well, that's because along with entrepreneurs who are in each of these areas, you're looking at investors. And there are over 250 angel investor networks, accelerator programs, venture funds, family offices who are investing in these early stage startups. And so who is it that they invest in? What is a startup? And where do the people put their money? Well, a startup is something that is founded by an entrepreneur. And in my taxonomy, there are 3.5 types of entrepreneurs. You say, what's a half type of an entrepreneur? Well, I'll tell you, that's somebody who talks a good game, who reads all the books about entrepreneurship and reads the magazines and watches the blog posts and can toss off, Jeff and Elon and Steve by their first name, but they never really actually start a company. Those are the people we tend to call wantrepreneurs. They want to be one, but they're really not. However, that does leave three legitimate types of entrepreneurs. The first of these are what I call survival entrepreneurs. These are entrepreneurs, and there are more of them, by the way, in Africa than in any other continent in the world. These are people who start a company because they have to. They want to put food on their table, feed their kids, feed their families, and they will do whatever it takes. I have enormous respect for survival entrepreneurs. They don't do it because they want to, they do it because they have to. And once they get to a certain level of economic stability, they will typically then move on and go back to a real world on a job or a farm or someplace else where they're not starting a business. But there are, however, two other types of entrepreneurs. And the next type are what I call the natural-born entrepreneurs. Now, these are the exact opposite of the survival entrepreneurs. They also are starting companies because they have to, but not for economic reasons, although they certainly would love the economics from it. No, these natural-born entrepreneurs, who account for about 1% of the population in the world, are people who just live to start businesses. I am one. I am actually a fifth generation one, so I know what it feels like. And I began starting companies when I was about 10 years old and started them all the way through high school and elementary school, college, business school. And that's what entrepreneurs do. But there's a third group of entrepreneurs, and these I call the self-made entrepreneurs. And I actually have as much respect for these guys, even more than I have for people like me who are the natural-born ones. These self-made entrepreneurs are people who are entrepreneurial, but don't have that crazy gene in them. They rationally look at an area that they know something about because they've worked in there or they're familiar with the marketplace. They see an opportunity, they see a hole in the market, they see the ability to use technology or some business model to solve that problem, and they go out rationally and plan and start it. And they make big companies out of that. The natural-born entrepreneurs may do it because they have to, and it's a passion, and they charge into it, maybe with not quite as much planning as the self-made entrepreneurs out there. But either way, when you get to a certain stage, you often require capital, and that capital comes from outside investors, hence the summit. This is the early stage investor summit where investors who are investing all over Africa come together, because there is an extraordinary ecosystem across Africa designed to help founders, to help entrepreneurs. There is a network of 292 innovation hubs and centers and accelerators pulled together by Afrolabs in 49 countries. There are 56 angel networks across the continent organized by ABAN. These are all here to help you, guide you, fund you, take advantage of them, because the future of Africa is entrepreneurship, and the future of Africa is the future of the world. Thank you.